I think the main thing you need yourself is knowledge, and to make sure that you're updated on that knowledge. And particularly in making future big decisions about ownership, that knowledge has to be around the kind of machinery costs and the cost of timeliness and things like that. In other words, if you haven't got the capacity 1 year in 3, what does that mean to me? To make good decisions about any machine, but particularly combines, even if you never own a machine, you have to have a certain amount of that knowledge. And I think that's the best way to kind of future-proof you.
As combines roll across the country, some farmers are battling to keep old machinery going, while others with newer and often larger combines are striving to cover ever bigger areas while still doing a good job. The working combine fleet today spans as much as 50 or 60 years between the oldest and newest models, yet the basic principles and how they work has changed very little in that time. You're listening to the latest episode of the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. We'd really appreciate it if you could listen, follow and give us a review on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts from. Last week I spoke to Dermot Forristal, a researcher at Teagasc Oak Park, about the evolution of combines over the years. In this episode I rejoined Dermot to continue the conversation, looking at whether the latest technologies are really improving combine performance or farm performance overall. We pick up the discussion where I asked Dermot, for a mid-sized tillage farmer, how do you weigh the decision between upgrading to a new combine, outsourcing the harvesting, or keeping an old model running?
It's difficult, Michael. There's no doubt about it. Because if you went back to, we're looking over a 40-year period here. If you went back to that 40-year period, there was one huge big difference than there is now. In other words, the UK farmers at that time were buying machines and trading them in after a number of years when they had plenty of use left in them, and when they were also of a size that was probably quite usable to us. Yeah. Today, that has changed. In other words, in the UK, they've got much more conscious themselves of their own operating costs, maybe in many areas. So the machines have got bigger, more complex, but they're also worked quite hard in most of those UK farms for a number of years. And so the availability of suitable machines is probably less than it was then. And if you do take them, because they are now so complex electronically, many of the things we've talked about earlier in our chat here, it doesn't kind of fit the model as well as it did in the past. In other words, a mechanically able farmer is not going to be able to keep those machines running as cheaply as their equivalent 20, 30, 40 years ago. So that is a big challenge. So to go back to your basic question, I think more people will have to look at and so, of course, the other thing side by side with that is that the manufacturers themselves, always wanting to offer something bigger and better, they're not offering small combines anymore. Or if they are, they're sourced from other markets that are really maybe quite low spec in some cases, or other manufacturing facilities. So the options, even in new machines for more modest capacity, are not, they're there, but they're not maybe as suitable as they should be for smaller growers. So yes, there's a challenge out there, and I think for many people, they will be looking towards, well, what alternatives are there in terms of ownership, because self ownership, mightn't be available or as much of an option as it would have been maybe 20 years in the past there, because that second-hand UK based machine is less suitable than it was then. So even if you are buying a second-hand machine, you might still need a kind of larger scale to justify its ownership and to justify its repair and upkeep over time. So alternatives, which might be contractor use, some sort of shared use of the machine, and there are many different structures, I suppose, they may have to come into it in more than they did certainly in the past.
It seems, the UK is kind of, it's I suppose it's not cut off completely, but it's less of an option maybe. I have heard of a number of farmers looking towards the continent and bringing combines from there. Is there, and we mentioned it and we talked about it before, that some combines are a bit more suited to Ireland and the UK maybe than stuff across maybe in the continent. But is that an option at all, or should farmers be very cautious if they're going across there?
No, I think it's an option. I think it is. I think it's a less familiar option to many people, but some people have, and some people for tractors have built up relationships with dealers in other European countries other than the UK. So I think it is an option. I think spec wise in that mostly they'll be similar and will fit. You want to be a little bit careful. Like there are some machines that, rather than a serial, say, drum and rasp bar setup, they may have something that'll handle a more wider variety of crops, such as grain, maize, and so on, and might have actually a different drum design in some cases. And in that case, you mightn't get the optimum performance from that drum and concave in a largely cereal crop like ours. But I think those cases will be few and far between. I think most of the combines will be similar. So I think if people can source more suitable ones, obviously there's a transport cost and there's the fact that it's a further disconnect. You're taking a little bit of a risk. But I do know people, yes, particularly have gone to France and have bought combines, and some have certainly had good experiences with that. So I think it probably will be necessary to trial wider, because I don't want to rule out self ownership completely. And Michael, you and I know, like, over the last couple of years, there's another good reason for self ownership, and that's biosecurity on farms.
Absolutely, yeah.
And that is a huge and concerning issue that we don't know how to address it, Michael. Really, I suppose completely, but the whole issue of herbicide resistance, grass weeds, very difficult to control herbicide resistant grass weeds. That is a good reason for having a little bit of security. If you haven't any of those weeds and you've always combined yourself and you've always baled your own straw or got rid of your own straw with your own equipment or whatever, that's a very good reason to stay in that space because you're sure then that you're not introducing something else.
There's a lot to be said for it. Can I just ask you, with the newer combines, so again, we're going back to this mid-sized farmer who's going to buy maybe a more modern machine, and he's bringing it back home. For that machine, is it a case where, and you already talked about there a little bit, that it's harder for even the good mechanically minded farmer to do all of the repairs themselves? Is it a case where you almost need an experienced, mechanic in the combine area to come in and actually service that every year?
I think the challenge there is that you are going to be pushed back towards the main dealers a little bit, and I'm not saying anything wrong with them, but the standards of service that they'll supply would be quite high and might be quite expensive. So, so you need, for lots of repairs, you're going to need access to diagnostics, and that's the key area. Like in the car industry, it's not too bad because the car industry is so big that you have independent makers of diagnostic equipment, if you know what I mean, and that can be accessed. You can go out and buy a fault code reader quite inexpensively and so on. So smaller independent mechanics can work in the car industry quite well. In the ag machinery, it's just not, there's not the volume in it for that. So you probably are, you will be forced back more often to main dealers for that part of the work. And, the main dealers provide a good service, but it will be, they will, that will cost them a lot to put in place. So you will be charged for that. So there's less scope, I suppose, when some of that end of things goes wrong, for having a less expensive repair. Or indeed, what a lot of people did was, they maintained their machines over the winter, themselves, did a certain amount themselves, used their own labor, if you like, for a certain number of weeks in the winter for replacing parts. There'll still be that. There'll still be belts that'll go, bearings that need replacing and so on. But layered on top of that is a series of actuators, a series of sensors, a heap of wiring, isobus, CAN bus type systems on the machine that are going to require a little bit more than just that to keep them upgraded, and certainly keeping vermin out of these machines is going to be a big challenge as well. So that's where, as I say, the ownership costs over a long kind of life might get a little bit higher on that end of things than it would be otherwise over a simple mechanical machine.
And I think, as you were saying earlier, on some of these electronics and bits and pieces, they're doing bits and pieces in the background that you don't even know they're doing them in the background. So I suppose it is pretty crucial that they are checked from time to time to make sure they still are working as they should be working.
Yeah, like there's one, I didn't give you that example, but the one really simple example is, if you're moving, from a field of cereals to a field of beans or something like that. I mean, there's lots of things in the combine that you should change and should check. Do you know what I mean? Whether it's the drum speed, the concave, gap, the fan speed, the direction of the fan, the sieves themselves or whatever. Your modern combine, you go up on it and you look and you see a button and on the screen that says beans and you press it and it's all done for you. So like there are benefits there. And if that's a system you want to tweak that, you just set your own one and you keep that for next year and so on. So there's huge benefits there in them. But as you say, Michael, all of those little components need to stay working for that to work.
In terms of the combine in itself, I mean, if you look towards Oak Park here, we generally look towards the end of the year with the combine, and the combine yield in terms of what comes off each trial is probably the monitor, I suppose, of whether the treatment is right or not. Should a farmer consider with some of the larger machines installing RTK, or a better way of a more accurate way of driving, along with yield monitors, to maybe try and do some of more on-farm and experimentation, I suppose, on their own farms to try and generate a bit more insight?
If you're doing any on-farm experimentation, like you are going to need to measure something, because that's the basics. And most of these things, you are interested in yield. So having a yield monitor on your combine gives you some scope down there, and that means that you can take yields and measure them for basically the working width of the machine that you're at. So the concept of maybe measuring strips and then maybe putting whatever you're looking at is, in other words, if it's a different disease control strategy or weed control or whatever, putting those out in strips. In other words, this is, I suppose, the basis of a tramline trial. So the yield monitor on the combine is certainly of use in that. Now, do you need RTK? What do you need with that? Not necessarily RTK. RTK gives you a better GPS position signal, far more accurate technical accuracy of 2 centimeters. I suppose what you need, particularly with using combines in tramline type tiles with yield monitors, is you need to know that your header, how much of your header is full. Is it 100% full? Is it 95% full? And with some yield mapping systems, even if you have RTK systems, it's still relying on you telling it how full that header is, or you driving to make sure it's full all the time. Okay, because that's where one bit of error could come into play. If you have a 6-meter header and you have an operator on it that's not too familiar with the machines, he won't be able to keep a constant amount in that. He might be, varying from 5.5 up to 5.9 meters, and that error will then come into the kind of yield error. Now, a simple way around that, well, a good operator used to the machine will be very consistent on that. A simple way around that is that you take full width strips within the tramline part of the trial. In other words, you just drive straight down one part of the header, probably guided by where your tramline is, but drive straight down, take all the crop into it, and then your 6-meter header is cutting a 6-meter strip, and those yield, even if that's what's set into your yield monitor, well, then those yield strips that you take will be an actual accurate area. So that doesn't necessarily need the RTK. How you access that data after, there's a couple of ways of doing it, but what you'd hope to be able to get is the raw data straight out of the combine. And some of the files delivered by telematics, you can get that back out, so that every maybe 5 meters distance that you move forward, it gives you a yield for that. In other words, you have 5 meters by 6 meters, roughly 30 meters square, and you can access that after. So before you think of doing a trial where you're going to use this, you would need to check how you're going to get this data back out, because depending on your system, even the age of your system, there might be different ways of getting that data back out. You can even set them up to harvest the strip and give you the total yield of the strip, which may be an easier way of doing it in some cases. But you do need to look into that at the beginning. You do need to make sure that your yield meter is calibrated, because they do need to be calibrated. And some of them as well, ones that are volume based, where they're looking at the volume of grain on an elevator paddle as it's going up. And that's the way some of them work. If they're volume based, they can be a little bit fooled sometimes by disease treatments that might hit your kpH, your specific weight. You might not get that picked up in a trial where you have some treatments that are given good kpH and some poor. That might fool the system a little bit on some of the yield monitors. But other than that, Michael, yes, if you were interested in doing those tramline type trials, and you do have to commit a bit of work to doing that, a yield monitor is very, very useful.
Okay. Their final question for you around this, and thanks very much for all your time. We've gone through an awful lot of stuff here. If a farmer was changing their machine, as we talked about already, and they're looking to try and future-proof the machine setup, what would be the one or two pieces of operational kit or stuff that should come on that, do you think, or would you advise that farmer to ensure that's there?
The main thing to future-proof what you're going to do is your own knowledge, really. That whether you're a farmer going to buy something new, and I'll try and come back and answer directly in a second, but if you're going to buy something new in a combine, or if you're going to do something different, like share the ownership in the combine in future with somebody else to come in some way of getting that scale that you need to justify the combine, or indeed even using a contractor. I think the main thing you need yourself is knowledge, and to make sure that you're updated on that knowledge. And particularly in making future big decisions about ownership, that knowledge has to be around the kind of machinery costs and the cost of timeliness and things like that. In other words, if you haven't got the capacity 1 year in 3, what does that mean to me? So I actually reckon that to make good decisions about any machine, but particularly combines, even if you never own a machine, you have to have a certain amount of that knowledge. And I think that's the best way to kind of future-proof you. Now, I know that's probably a little bit to one side of your question there, because I think you were thinking of, well, what technology is on the combine.
No, that's fair enough, yeah.
But I do think that's the basic thing, that you need to know, what contributes to machinery costs, the cost and value of timeliness, because there is a cost and a value to it. In other words, if you have enough capacity to cover you for every scenario that you're going to get all your grain in below 18% moisture every possible year, that's the wrong size of combine, because you're paying too much for it. So you have to be able to judge, well, where is that correct? And the correct answer is, 1 year in 4 or 5, I'm going to have some of my grain at 23% or 22%. That might be the right answer to that. So it's having that knowledge to be able to make those decisions, to know what the impact of weather and crop choice, because we've great abilities now. For other reasons, we're extending rotations. But if you have winter barley, winter oilseed rape, winter oats, then winter wheat or spring barley, and then spring beans or something at the other side, you have a much bigger window. But yet you could fall foul of weather a little bit more on that winter bean element or that spring bean element at the end and something else. So knowledge about those sort of things, knowledge about the value of good quality work, knowledge about the biosecurity thing that we talked about. How much is that worth to us, Michael? Those are all hugely important.
That's good enough, because I think the more than likely the machine is probably going to come with more than enough technology that if you can get your head around the half, it you'll be doing fairly well. But I think all of the other bits and pieces are maybe the more important ones you talked about already, in terms of operating costs and what that actually means to you on the farm. I think that's very good advice from you, Dermot. Thanks very much again for all your insights into that.
No problem, Michael.
So that's it for today, and my thanks to Dermot for joining me on the podcast. It's been a pleasure working alongside Dermot for the past 20 years on a wide range of projects and events. He's always been a font of knowledge, not just on machinery, but on many topics. And he's been consistently willing to support initiatives across the entire industry across his long career. Dermot will retire from Teagasc in the coming weeks, and I'd like to wish him the very best as he begins his new chapter in life. Dermot should be greatly missed, not only in Teagasc, but also by the wider farming community. So with that, if you enjoyed the podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague, and for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy, thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.